How can we pay $137 for a screw? Or how can we buy the world's most expensive submarine, specifically designed for the Cold War, years after the Cold War ended, with no apparent use in sight? Not just that, but two of them. Or how can a government get a $5 or $6 trillion budget, yet be chronically unable to accomplish its own stated goals?
21st century businesses need 21st century infrastructure.
It is also time to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure.
Our infrastructure used to be rated the best in the world. Now, according to the World Economic Forum, we rank 13th in the world. Well, that's about to change.
If you're used to hearing a version of this story that lays blame entirely on bureaucrats and politicians, then my answer today might be a little surprising to hear. So I do think that's part of the answer. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what I think are the most important elements from these books, which will be in the description, to lay out the big picture of why governments are wasteful with focus on the United States. And we're going to start by thinking very broadly about efficiency. If your government is inefficient, it means you need to put more resources into it, like time, money, and effort, to get the same thing done as a more efficient government. So inefficiency is a form of waste. If your government is deeply inefficient, it means you need to put a tremendous amount of resources into it to get anything done. The United States seems decently far down that track, and a major reason why boils down to American culture. An enduring part of American culture is to distrust your own government. So Americans are wary of their government. They berate it, and they see it as being maybe a major step or two away from tyranny. That attitude led Americans to create a government where distrust is baked into the system itself. As James Madison put it in Federalist 51, America is a compound republic where the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. You can probably already see how this isn't exactly describing the makings of an efficient government. If power is broken up between different departments, and those departments have the ability to control each other, that hampers the ability to get anything done. So the Constitution, for example, grants Congress all legislative powers, but it's the president's responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So if a government agency is created by law, like the FDA or the FBI, then who has control over them? Congress or the executive? Or how autonomous should these agencies be? In practice, the answer is that they all fight it out. So it's not just Congress and the executive. There's also the court system and all kinds of subcommittees and private interests that weigh in on what they think the government should and shouldn't do, while government agencies fight to do things the way they see it. As James Wilson put it in Bureaucracy, policymaking in the parliamentary governments in Europe looks like a prize fight. Two contenders, having earned the right to enter the ring, square off against each other for a prescribed number of rounds. When one fighter knocks the other out, he is declared the winner and the fight is over. Policymaking in the United States is more like a barroom brawl. Anyone can join in. The combatants fight all comers and sometimes change sides. No referee is in charge, and the fight lasts not for a fixed number of rounds, but indefinitely, or until everybody drops from exhaustion. It's important to remember that we're paying for all this. While we do have power thoroughly broken up and checked in America, it comes at the cost of getting things done relatively quickly and efficiently. I think that's something that most of us are to some extent aware of, but there's another aspect of this story, another form of distrust towards government that I think we're much less aware of. And to understand that, we need to think about how organizations, including governments, achieve goals. One way is for managers to set a goal and maybe some guidelines for behavior. But then from there, they let their employees use discretion when it comes to figuring out how to achieve that goal. So this is a method where employees are guided, but can think for themselves when it comes to solving problems. The other method sets goals too, but from there, it doesn't allow employees to exercise their discretion, and instead, it gives them an exact series of rules to follow in order to achieve that goal. So the first method is a discretion-based model. And the second method is a rule-based model. If you think of an average small or mid-sized restaurant, as an employee, you'd probably have some freedom to dress how you want and treat customers or prepare food however you think is best. You'd probably still have a boss that would set some rules and some goals for you, but you'd probably be allowed a fair amount of discretion in your work. Now think of a fast food restaurant where employees are tightly controlled in all of those ways. Employees are told, for example, exactly how long burgers should be cooked for and in what order they should be laid out and flipped. Everything is so standardized that you can go anywhere in the country and the food and the experience is more or less the same. It's a highly rule-bound organization. When it comes to this aspect of organization, the United States stands out among modern democracies. The United States relies on rules to control the exercise of official judgment to a greater extent than any other industrialized democracy. That was a trend that started taking off in the 60s in reaction to the civil rights movements, and also when public trust in government broke down following Vietnam and Watergate. So we moved into a model of governing where autonomy was to be purged. Government instead would be organized on the basis of clear rules, taking into account the rights of anyone who might be affected by a decision. So whether they're teachers or police officers or FDA employees or government employees in general, in America, we're now in the habit of trying to standardize their behavior by imposing on them a heavy-handed set of rules. Some processes work well and even work best when being tightly bound by rules. Social Security is a good example of that. The Social Security approval process is very simple. If someone's old enough to qualify and if they paid into the system, that's it. They get it. So there's no ambiguity there, and there's no need to bring your discretion into it. So Social Security works well being tightly bound by rules. It makes it work faster and more reliably and efficiently. But some jobs are better done when people can think for themselves. Rules in some cases can slow down a system. They can make an entire government perform badly. Rules are often made by people who don't work in these positions, and they can often make jobs more difficult to do. They can also drive away talented employees, leaving us with employees who hide behind these rules, whether they make sense or not. And as you probably know, it's very difficult to fire bad government employees. This is a phenomenon linked to trust. We don't trust our officials to exercise their own judgment, so we try to standardize their behavior by imposing on them a set of rules and regulations. So these rules come from all of us. This is a result of democratic processes. Every restraint and requirement originates in somebody's demand for it. In America, this seems to have, ironically, led to us making an ineffectual government, a government that can't do the things that the public demands of it. Here's Francis Fukuyama giving his take on it. Because Americans historically distrust the government, they typically aren't willing to delegate to the government authority to make decisions in the manner of other democratic societies. Instead, Congress mandates complex rules that reduce the government's autonomy and make decisions slow and expensive. The government then doesn't perform well, which confirms people's original distrust. Government agencies often impose rules on themselves, but that's typically to avoid lawsuits and to avoid getting in trouble with oversight committees, which again is a result of democratic processes. So here we have two manifestations of distrust. One is our system of checks and balances that makes it so power is thoroughly broken up in America. And the other is our heavy-handed system of rules and regulations. If you combine those two together, you have a uniquely inefficient government. Which is why if you hear a politician pledging to take on a big infrastructure project, you probably shouldn't hold your breath. They have to, for example, conduct environmental impact studies. They have to follow certain contracting procedures that proves that their hiring is fair and equitable. They have to follow complex budgeting procedures, where the budget is run through committees and subcommittees. They have to listen to petitions from the public, people who are paying for it and might be affected by it, which means they could also expect to deal with lawsuits. So if you take all those together, it means the process becomes very slow and expensive, and often isn't done at all. I think it's important to mention that this process is designed to bring along a value of its own, and that value is something that we should consider when we're talking about how wasteful or inefficient this is. For example, making sure that people affected by a policy have a say in approving it makes the process slower and more expensive, but adds in democratic value. Other governments around the world don't have to do that. They can do what they want without asking for the public's permission. So that lets them do things relatively quickly and efficiently, but it comes at a democratic cost. So if we like some of these processes, or even all of these processes, if we like the value that they bring, and if we think they're working as intended, then to the extent that they affect our spending, it shouldn't be considered waste, because we believe we're getting value for the money. So that's something to think about. The next form of waste that I want to talk about comes from lobbying, specifically antisocial forms of lobbying. Lobbying that's done to benefit your own interests without regard to how it affects others, namely the broad public. So we're going to look at how that affects our spending. Government expenditures come at a social cost. We're paying for it. Taxpayers are. So think of the government budget as a whole pie. It's a finite amount that we ideally want to carefully spend in pro-social ways that help the public in the long run, so we're better off having spent it. In America, we're all technically free to try to lobby our legislators to influence spending, but I personally haven't tried to do that, and I'm guessing you haven't either. The reason why is because the incentives aren't strong enough. If your interests are with the broad public, if you're trying to do something that you really believe will help most people, then you yourself, if you're successful, will only get a small benefit back in return. So we basically make a calculation to ourselves. We realize that we wouldn't be able to help the entire group and ourselves in a way that makes it worth it. It'd be one thing if we're being paid a salary, because a salary is a kind of incentive. But you don't want to voluntarily lose resources in the deal. You don't want to invest your own time, money, and effort into something if you can only expect a small benefit back in return. So you wish that someone else would do it. But the thing is, that person would also prefer that someone else would make it happen, while they sit back and get the benefit, and so on, and so on, and so on. Which is why, with the exception of unique situations where strong incentives emerge, like the need to repel an invasion, we shouldn't expect the largest groups in society to intentionally act in their group interest. The incentives for any one given member under normal circumstances just aren't strong enough. But if you're part of a smaller group, like a company or an industry or a profession, then you tend to get a larger reward back relative to the amount of work that you put in to benefit that group. It also tends to be easier to suppress free riders, people who want to get benefits without putting their own work in. So smaller groups have a stronger incentive to organize. Any one member can expect to get a larger reward for their work. So that was a lot of theory, I know. Here's what I'm getting at. This explains why, in the lobbying world, you can expect to see the largest interests underrepresented and smaller interests overrepresented. Many of them advocate for policies that are antisocial in nature, which here basically means they don't care if they're wasting the public's money. So they advocate for policies that are inefficient for society as a whole, but they're advantageous for the smaller groups because the costs of the policies fall disproportionately on the unorganized, which is most people. To give an example of that, let's look at the American sugar industry. The sugar industry in America is historically a large player in the lobbying world, given how small of an industry it is. The reason why is because they're able to get an even bigger benefit back from the government. Because of their work, we have sugar subsidies that keeps the price of sugar artificially high in America. As far as I understand, that's good for the sugar industry, but it's bad for most Americans. It has a net negative effect on society. Consumers have to pay an artificially high price in stores. And if the market prices fall below levels guaranteed by the sugar program, taxpayers pick up the bill. That might have been too small of an example for you. You wanted to see a bigger example of waste. But that's the point. Any given example of this type of waste is typically small. It's small enough where it's just an annoyance for you, so you won't do anything about it. But to the smaller interest that's getting the benefit, like the sugar industry, it's a big deal. So they're motivated to keep it going, and you're not motivated to stop it. Also, you have to remember that this is happening at scale. So this is sort of a death by 1,000 cuts kind of waste. This is something that's done because it benefits the small groups, in this case the sugar industry, and perhaps the politicians being lobbied. But this is widely thought of as something that hurts the economy and the broad public, making it essentially harmful and wasteful. It can also come down to information capture. Lobbyists tend to have arguments prepared that make their preferred policies sound good. So if they have a monopoly of information over a politician, if a politician only hears their side of the story, they might genuinely believe that it's a good policy. Because again, there's no larger organization forming to counter these interests. So there's no, for example, powerful American Taxpayers Association that makes sure that American tax dollars are spent wisely. As far as I know, there's nothing stopping us from making that organization. We just don't do it. This means that as lobbying becomes increasingly influential over our politics, we can expect to see our policies disproportionately bent in the favor of small interests, often in antisocial, wasteful ways. The thing is, in the mid-20th century, we went through a political transformation. Our government became more decentralized and open, making it easier for anyone sufficiently dedicated to access our government officials, which led to an explosion of interest groups in Washington, an explosion of lobbying firms, and the birth of the modern lobbying industry, which I think is why we can't seem to get adequate value for our healthcare spending in America. America spends more per capita on healthcare than anyone else in the world. The red arrow on the screen is pointing at the amount of government and mandatory spending. But the quality of our healthcare doesn't seem to match our spending. We're consistently ranked poorly compared to other industrialized democracies. It's worth flagging that our healthcare system seems to be, like our government, overly bureaucratized. America has an overly rule-bound healthcare system, but it also probably doesn't help that our legislation intended for the public interest, intended to help middle and low-income people, is tweaked in ways that bring huge benefits to smaller interests that the policies were not intended for. The Affordable Care Act, for example, ran to about 900 pages as a result of all the concessions and side payments that had to be made to interest groups, including doctors, insurance companies, and the pharmaceutical industry. It would be one thing if we were intentionally trying to pass legislation to help these groups, but that wasn't the point of the Affordable Care Act. Provisions like these tend to be quietly snuck into larger bills without the public or even many legislators knowing. The result is that our spending on healthcare isn't reflected in the quality of our coverage, making our spending largely wasteful. Military expenditures are a little more complex. We have a philosophy of maintaining state-of-the-art technology with our military. If companies develop technology for us that's never existed before, you can make the argument that we should pay a premium for that. A lot of people see the price tag on those kinds of purchases and believe it's wasteful. You'd have to deal with whether or not it's wasteful on a per-case basis, and I think getting into that would be inappropriate for this video. So we're going to ignore that kind of potential waste. Avoiding that complication, there are still plenty of examples of waste to go around. The easiest ones to point out are ones where smaller interests, again, outweigh national interests, where smaller interests get the government to pay for things that the country doesn't need. For example, it's notoriously difficult to close unnecessary military bases. The reason why is because they provide jobs in the area. Local interests fight to keep them open, and strong enough national interests don't counter them. Congressional members fight to keep the bases open to keep jobs in their district, even though the jobs don't really provide a benefit to the country paying for them. This is also another case where the separation of powers seems to be causing waste. We don't give the Pentagon the power to close bases as it sees fit. So they have to engage in long, drawn-out fights with the member of Congress whose district the base is in. Fights that, without national backing or national attention, they typically lose. Lockheed Martin also famously plays smaller interests against larger ones by spreading their manufacturing around the country, which seems to be their way of putting their thumb on the scale when members of Congress are deciding whether or not to approve their contracts. Members of Congress might be tempted to provide jobs to their district, regardless of how necessary the contract is or how expensive it is. There are sometimes blatant cases where companies get us to buy things because it's good for the company and it's good for local interests. The Seawolf submarine is a good example of that. The Seawolf submarines were a product of the Cold War. They were designed to be able to quietly hunt Soviet submarines. They were also the most sophisticated and the most expensive submarines ever designed. Years after the Soviet Union collapsed, we purchased 2 more of them, even though the president was explicitly against it. So how did that happen? We can't definitively prove it, but it certainly seems like lobbyists helped make it happen. The affected companies put on an intense lobbying campaign that helped create a good atmosphere for the vote that approved the submarines, which included writing editorials in favor of the Seawolf in hometown papers, staging visits from workers back home who would suffer if the ship were canceled, and setting up appearances on local TV of retired admirals sympathetic to the cause. The argument made was that building a submarine of that quality took unique skill and experience, and in particular, the welders were valuable and difficult to train. If we didn't build the Seawolves, then the welders would disappear into the workforce, and there would be a possibility that we would lose the ability to make high-quality submarines. Even if that's true, did we have to build the most expensive submarines ever designed just to keep these welders around? To these companies, the answer is yes, because their existence depended on it. The military is typically obligated to buy things at the lowest cost possible, but if there's only one provider for a product, then that might not matter and we might get gouged on prices. If it's a big ticket item, the military will still probably try to bargain on the price, but if it's a small ticket item, we might buy it at whatever the company prices it at, even if it's 10 to 100 times over cost, which is where we get $137 screws from. Incidentally, I think because we know what small items should cost, there tends to actually be quite a large public reaction when we find out that the military dramatically overpays for something like that. So it turns into kind of a horror story for the military. But instead of responding by punishing the people or the company responsible, or by tweaking the rules without further complicating them, we instead respond by adding more rules and more oversight, making our budgeting and our weapons procural processes increasingly complex over time. This is what they currently look like. I packed a lot into this video, and I'm afraid that some of it might have been lost. So here's what I roughly said, summed up into 3 points. The first is that the way we break power up in this country makes us less efficient, requiring us to engage in messy, drawn-out political battles to act. The second is that our especially rule-bound system also makes our government inefficient, and also probably drives away talented employees. And third is that the incentives are such that smaller groups take money from the larger group. The smaller groups enrich themselves at the public's expense without providing an equivalent benefit back to the public. I think that covers the big picture of why our government is wasteful. That being said, there's still quite a lot that I left on the cutting room floor. Most importantly, I never mentioned fraud. So I'm going to deal with that in a pinned comment. I think this is the most that I can pack into one video. So, till next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.